Hi and welcome to the Homeopathy Health Show. I'm embody, a fourth generation homeopath with over 25 years of professional experience and practice in this field of healing. The Homeopathy Health Show is the online voice of homeopathy around the world, promoting and raising awareness of this truly unique system of healing, which is suitable for all ages, young and old. Every week I invite guests from the world of homeopathy to come and share their experiences, their work, offer insights, and essentially talk all things homeopathy. Why not visit www.liketreatslike.co.uk and click on the radio and podcast button to listen to the latest episodes. So let's begin today's show here on UK Health Radio, the world's #1 talk health radio. Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Homeopathy Health Show here on the UK Health Radio Network. And of course, I'm your host, embody. You know, you could refer to me as your friendly neighborhood homeopath, but it really depends where you are, because of course I'm based in the UK. Now, I have some wonderful news for you, which is that I have a returning guest to the Homeopathy Health Show, none other than Ian Watson, who I must say, as far as I'm concerned, certainly, is pretty much a legend now. A living legend, I have to say, and may it long continue. Ian is a homeopath, an author, a teacher, and a facilitator. And in fact, he was on episode 53 of the Homeopathy Health Show, talking about mental well-being. So do check that out on all the podcast platforms, on my YouTube channel, or of course, you can go to ukhealthradio.com and just search up Homeopathy Health and you'll find it there and you can stream it on demand. Now, Ian has become widely known as a speaker and writer in homeopathy and works tirelessly to help others in their well-being. He actually has trained in a wide variety of psychological and emotional healing disciplines before discovering the simple principles of innate well-being that now form the foundation of his work. Ian has taught this groundbreaking understanding to health professionals, to business leaders, school children, and countless individuals, not only in the UK, but around the world. I quote, Ian says, "I have long considered that the key ingredient in any self-healing process is a transformation in consciousness. My life's passion and greatest joy is to work as a facilitator of self-healing and inner transformation, combining the gentlest and most effective techniques that I have found with my own intuition and experience gained through working in the alternative healing field for more than 20 years. Ian Watson, thank you so much. Wonderful to talk to you again on the Homeopathy Health Show.
Thank you, Ati. It's nice to be back with you.
I have so many things to ask you, similar to how I did last time. But I was, we were having this conversation on email. We were going to and fro about possible subjects that may interest the listeners. And I know we focused on two specific ones, but before we go into them, nowadays, a lot of people around the world, Ian, talk about mindfulness. As an expert, as somebody who's in there day in and day out, what does that actually mean? What does what does mindfulness mean? Does it mean, I know that's an outtake, isn't it? But hey, I'm going to leave that in, okay? It happens. What does mindfulness mean to people? Is it actually mindfulness based on an individual's understanding of what it may be? Or is there, you could say, a broad definition as such?
Well, what an interesting question. And I think it's not coincidental that you had a slip of the tongue there, Ati, because I was having a conversation on this topic just recently, actually. A similar question came up in the group, as it often does, because people that come to my workshops often have a background of some form of meditation practice or other. And many of those practices go under the general heading of mindfulness. So I don't know who the originator of that term was or what they intended, but I know I can say what it roughly seems to be pointing to, which is it's generally considered to be a practice in which a person gains awareness of their own thoughts and feelings, let's say from a perspective of the awareness itself. So rather than being identified with the content of your experience, in other words, whatever's arising in your mind, whatever is sensations are happening in your body, rather than being identified with those too closely, the purpose of mindfulness, as I understand it, is just again to have a little kind of gap open up so that you can actually just watch those processes passing by from a place of neutrality, let's say, so that you're not caught up in the reactions and the sensations that are passing through. And people who practice that over a period of time and become adept at it tend to report that it brings increased sense of peace in their life and an ability to let things go. You know, they can see when they're getting caught up and are able to let things go a bit more easily. So it certainly has a value, I think, there. I think the name is interesting, though, because when I was joking, when I answered this question to the person who asked it before, I said, really, we should call it mind emptiness or mindlessness, as you said.
Oh, interesting. So I was
Because,
right.
well, in a way, yes, because what anybody who follows such a practice will start to discover is that the feeling of peace itself is what's most natural to us. And it's only when we become overly busy in our mind, when we're overthinking something or we're giving too much attention to something that's passing through our consciousness, then you could say that's when we're mindful. You know,
Yeah.
the fuller our mind is, the less peaceful we are, basically. And one of the things that the understanding that I teach, one of the effects of that understanding, the three principles understanding that I teach to people these days, and I tell people this ahead of time, what it tends to do, it takes things off people's mind. It doesn't put things on their mind. So, which is kind of the opposite to the teaching that I used to do. You know, I used to teach a lot of content, a lot of remedies and practices and so on. And so people would leave with more on their mind than when they came in. My intention nowadays tends to be the opposite of that. If they leave with less on their mind, I'm happy because I know that they'll be more connected to that inner sense of peace and well-being.
You know, this leads me on to asking you a follow-up question, which is to do with, and this is related to mindfulness, is to do with personalities and the fact that we all walk, we all walk this earth with different personalities, even though we may not necessarily want them, but it just happens because of the situations. So, son, father, husband, friend, teacher, facilitator, there's different personalities. So, does mindfulness allow one to see themselves, or is the aim or objective certainly, or should be, should I say? I suppose it's not really a question, but more of a just having a conversation here. But does mindfulness allow you to see yourself as you're supposed to be? Is that where we're heading? And the follow-up to that is actually, can we get away from those personalities, or are they so needed? They have to be there, right? Because being a son is very different to being a father. Being a father is very different to being a husband, and so on and so forth. What's your insights on this?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I would, first of all, I would draw a distinction between what you're calling personality versus some of the roles that you're describing, because the roles kind of change, let's say, more readily, more frequently. Even in the course of a day, we can go in and out of different roles. Yeah, you can be practitioner during the day, you can be father in the evening, etc. Whereas I would suggest that what we're calling personality doesn't change quite so frequently.
Mm.
It's something that tends to take form as we develop, first of all, as a youngster, and largely due to the input of both other people, but also our own personal life experiences as well. So there's a multiple number of factors coming to play there. You know what? It's not just the conditioning and the ideas that our parents would shape us with, but it's also our own life experiences, the kinds of conclusions that we draw about life and about ourselves, all of that. So I mean, personality really, to me, it's a kind of it's a set of ideas and beliefs about who we think we are.
Hmm.
So let's call it that, which does get modified over time. You know, some of the things that we used to believe about ourselves, maybe as a teenager, we might look back and think, yeah, not so much anymore. You know, that's changed. But there is something I think a bit deeper than that. Let's call it character or basic temperament. in homeopathy, we recognize there are certain temperaments which are recognizable even at a very young age. Even babies and 1 or 2 year olds, you can see there's a difference of temperament. I would say that's almost pre-personality, that fundamental level of characteristic, how we would describe the basic characteristics of this individual. That doesn't tend to change so much over a person's life from what I've seen. But the layer on top of that, let's say the personality layer, that does get modified over time. And it seems to me that a lot of spiritual traditions recognize both the necessity of that. It seems to be something that just naturally occurs. It doesn't seem to be anything we can prevent from happening. Therefore, there must be a good reason for it. But often there's a tendency in what Carl Jung was very, I think, astute at this in this particular area. He talked about the two main stages of life. And the first stage is very much to do with the formation of personality, of ego personality, let's say, where we're creating an idea of who we think we are. And that includes, what kind of role we play in life and in society and so on and so forth. But then as we move into what he called the second half of life, and there isn't a fixed age for that, it's just a question of maturation, let's say. The second half of life very often is where we start to let go of a lot of that which we've identified ourselves as being. There's a kind of necessary shedding of those things that we've accumulated. And in order that something else can start to come forth, which he called the self, or you could say the true self, which is not any of those previously formulated ideas and so on. It's something that comes from a deeper sense of who we are. Some would describe that more as the soul or the inner self. And that to me is an interesting thing to be aware of in one's life, to recognize where, just what stage of life you're at. Because there's a stage where it seems to be, it's appropriate to be putting on that kind of overcoat of personality. But there's another stage of life where we need to outgrow it. And if we don't, we start to feel the limitations of it. And you'll see this happen, when a person starts to feel boxed in by their own ideas of themselves. And that's the time for some of that to be shed and so that something deeper gets revealed.
It's fascinating you're sharing this, because it leads on to the self. And nowadays we find so many people, you've said something so profound, because if we witnessed, I know so many people, and, through life, you grow with them. And there comes a certain time, and again, like you've correctly said, it doesn't matter. It's not about age. It's just the time where they think, do you know what? Life is so complicated. Let me just simplify it. For a very, a cheesy example, but, one bar of soap is enough. One toothbrush is enough. That type of thing. Let's limit it. I don't need 10 pairs of jeans if I'm not going to wear them. One pair or two pair is fine.
Yeah.
And I know that's a very, physical example, but even with life generally, people think, I'm working too much and I don't need to do this now. Let me step away. Yeah. And it's so important, isn't it? And so many people are now doing that, aren't they?
Yeah. And it's necessary, and it's always been necessary, but I would say even more so now, because the tendency to accumulate is probably greater in the first half of life than it ever was. And so then the corresponding necessity to divest ourselves of that which we actually don't, not only do we no longer need it, but it will be a hindrance to our growth if we don't let certain things go when they need to go. I went through my own version of that. I mean, it's often described as a midlife crisis or a midlife transition, which it often is. It can take that form. And my own version of that was starting to feel overwhelmed and burnt out as a homeopath, which kind of caught me by surprise, because I loved my work. It wasn't the consequence of doing something that I didn't like or didn't enjoy. I loved it. I thought it would be my life's work. I couldn't ever see my work being anything else. But what I hadn't seen was that, first of all, I was overdoing it. When you're doing something that you love, it's harder to notice that you're overdoing it, because you love it so much. You spend, excessive hours at the job, which you wouldn't do so much probably if you didn't really care about, the people that you're working with and so on. So there was that aspect, but there was also the fact that my work was ready to take a different form. And that's the bit I didn't see coming. And what happened was I was once sitting with a client, and the window cleaner came to the practice and was cleaning the windows with a big smile on his face, like waving at me through the window. And I remember looking at him, and the thought that occurred to me was, oh, I'd like his job. Which wasn't actually true, because I didn't really want to be a window cleaner. It's not an easy job, especially in the winter. But what I wanted was the feeling that it looked like he had compared to the feeling that I was in. And that feeling of just lightness and freedom, and you do your work and you go home and you forget about it. I thought, well, I want that, I want to experience that again. And that was a wake up for me to make some changes in my own work, and again I had to realize what I had to let go of at that point, which turned out to be quite a lot. But that created the space for what was coming in next. And again, that couldn't have happened if I just stayed in that busy mode. Then there's no room for, we're not able to listen to the whispers of wisdom, if you like, which are trying to nudge us in the direction that we need to go in.
This again takes me on again with the same subject on towards achievements, because we're all so caught up, aren't we? I mean, life can be so, I don't know, it's so sort of like the first two chapters or the first three chapters are always so similar, aren't they? You grow up, you learn, you get a degree, and after the degree, you have to have a car, you have to have a house, you have to, and please don't get me wrong, but it can become quite monotonous. It's like I think of some of the entrepreneurs who have been quite successful, the good ones, are in the world, and they and I'm not saying obviously I'm not saying do this, but I'm just saying as an example, they at 16 years old they said, okay, I think that's enough education. Let me go and do this because my cylinders are firing, at full, and I can do this and I want to do this, and they've made it a success, right? It's
Yeah.
something out of the ordinary. It's not that same path which everybody is following. And there's some benefits there, right? Because you're letting go of so many things which can sometimes take up 30 years of your life, right?
Yeah.
Just to get settled, just to move into a house. Even that's difficult in the UK, as we know, because of prices. But, there's this process, isn't it?
Yeah.
But there's also letting go on the other side, and people don't actually perhaps have that skill of letting go, maybe, or thinking outside of the box.
Well, I think everyone has that capacity, let's say, to let go, but depending on how much we trust the life process or are afraid of the life process, then letting go looks more difficult or easier,
Mm.
depending on where we sit on that axis. But I feel I was fortunate, I think, because I was that 16-year-old who dropped out of school, didn't go to university. And then had a relatively conventional job for a short period, which I realized wasn't me. He just wasn't doing it. I realized I'm never going to do this, for the rest of my life. So I quit the job without really knowing what I was going to do next. But I had an inkling of what my interest was. And I thought, well, if I follow that, things will work out. And you could say I had that entrepreneurial spirit already. And of course, that's what happened. It did work out. And for me, I feel like I saved myself a lot of misery, a lot of unnecessary, forcing myself to go through things that seems to be what society approves of. I just didn't do that. I didn't take that path. And I have to say, I've never regretted it.
That's actually the most powerful statement, the fact that there are no regrets. That's so important, isn't it? Because so many of us live with regrets. Only if I had done this, if I had taken this route, if I had studied that, if I had did this, if I had done a certain thing at work, which I would have. But it's a constant battle, isn't it? Whereas you can actually step back and just let it flow, and let you, the I am, lead you towards what you need to do.
Yeah. And I tend to be of the opinion that it's never too late, even for people who might look back with some regret of what they didn't do earlier in life. What I always say to people is, well, start now. It's like,
Yeah.
look at where you are now. If you're seeing a possibility now, that you couldn't really, you weren't able to follow at an earlier stage in your life for whatever reason, rather than dwelling on what you couldn't do, have a look at what you could do now. And I've seen people make remarkable changes in their life in their 50s, 60s, and even 70s, which, they hadn't necessarily seen as being possible before. But who's to say it's not possible?
It's And I've had this conversation very recently with one person specifically who said that, oh, I've got health issues and I'm too old as far as my age is too advanced that I can study homeopathy, but I really want to do it. I said, who said to you that you're too old? Number one. Number two, maybe this is your time because you may end up helping more people in 10 to 20 years than I could help in 70 years.
Yeah,
It's who knows? But if you don't do it, you're never going to know,
that's it.
you know? And it's so important, isn't it, to find that it you mentioned, you went through this um entrepreneurial streak. And when I wanted, even though, as you know, homeopathy's been in my family for a long, long time, that doesn't mean growing up with homeopathy necessarily means you are going to also do homeopathy. It wasn't like that. And I had my own choice and decision. But it happened organically. And when it happened, it was brilliant. But when it happened, Ian, there was hardly any food on the table.
Mm.
And this is not that long ago, right? I mean, 25 years, it's not that long ago. And it was challenging, but we persevered and it worked out. And today it's brilliant, being able to help so many people. And of course, here, look, we've got the Homeopathy Health Show and talking to, charismatic individuals like yourself, and things work out, right? But there has to be some sort of patience as well. If you're
Yeah.
going to do something new, it's not going to be roses and you're going to walk on them straight away. It doesn't work that way, does it? I mean,
No,
what's your guidance on this?
I totally agree. It's going to involve some struggle. It's going to involve some hardship. It's also going to involve sacrifice. That certain things have to be given up if you're going to pursue a path which is truly your own path. And you're going to have to give up certain types of security, for example, or certain material comforts, as you say. I did too. I remember when I was first without a job and I was just starting to study homeopathy by myself. I didn't even know there was a homeopathy college at that point. I was just reading these old books
Mm.
and accumulating some remedies. I was living on lentil soup for a
Oh,
period of months. But you know what? I was very happy with what it looks, quite an austere way of living from the outside. But I was way happier than when I was working for a job that actually paid me really well. And then I had to keep having holidays and so on to supposedly to feel happy, to compensate for the job, that I didn't really want. I didn't need to do any of that anymore. I was finding that fulfillment within myself. And when you're following something that is truly your own path, that fulfillment sustains you and it enables you to put up with the necessary sacrifice and hardship. So, it doesn't feel like, to me, it didn't really feel like a choice. It just felt like a no-brainer. It's like, of course, I don't mind. I don't mind being poor for a while. I'm doing what I want to do, It's
yeah.
worth it.
By the way, we also survived on lentils, just so you know. I make sure I don't share it often, but I do tell people that because I actually personally don't like lentils. And to be stuck with only lentils was challenging, I tell you, in itself. And I thought, oh my God, is this really it? Well,
Yeah.
surely there must be something else to eat. But it does it helps mold you, doesn't it? Especially when it happens at a younger age, perhaps than a more advanced age, because it's boy, is it a life lesson, right? And it's a beautiful life lesson because it's all about keeping things simple. And again, you said, when you talk, it's so poetic almost sometimes, and you mentioned just now that you were at peace, okay? And that's important. You were happy with the path you'd chosen. And we go back to, people can spend half of their life or all of their life with regrets. But if you've chosen something, you have to have that determination and patience and commitment and say, I'm going to make a go of it. And things do work out. It may be 1 month, it might be 3 months, it might be a year, it might be longer, but they always do work out. It's only when you give up, things sometimes fall by the wayside, don't they?
Yeah, that's right. And I suppose that's also part of the journey and the challenge is recognizing whether there's enough juice in it for you to see it through.
Hmm.
Because that's not the case for everything, right? Some people might need to try a few things only to discover, no, that's not it. I was close, but not close enough.
Hmm.
That's not going to sustain me through the necessary periods of hardship. Whereas when you really find the kind of the deeper resonance with something, it will sustain you, and you'll put up with what you need to put up with to get you through. And then I think what comes through that experience is a deepening trust in what you say. You have to have the experience that things work out in order to know that they work out.
Mm. Yeah.
You know, ahead of time, you don't know that. It's a leap of faith, right? And you could say ultimately it's always a leap of faith, because every time we go through a cycle like that, it's a new experience. There's no guarantee it's going to work out this time because it did last time. But at least when you've had that experience once or twice, you've got something to fall back on. And I found that to be really helpful. I'm very grateful I had that experience early in my life. You know, I took the leap relatively early,
Mm.
and that enabled me to kind of jump off that springboard multiple times since. I'm very happy with that.
Interesting. Just as you were saying that, it took me back. I was going to mention to you, um, during that hardship, I just recently got married as well. But it was, it was something that my wife really gave me so much support, and I think that made a world of difference to me. Um, because it can sometimes, being on your own can be very challenging. Um, but when there's somebody there to say, "Look, you chose this path. I'm behind you," or actually, in my case, I'm at your side. Let's do it together.
Yeah.
It can really bolster you, isn't it, and your spirits, and you think, "Yes, okay, this is good."
Yeah, and it's wonderful that you can look back and really, feel the gratitude for that and
Mm.
see the value of that. Yeah, yeah.
Ian, it takes me on to uncertainty in life. Now, we were having this conversation. I'm not going to share this conversation or on the show, but we were having it just before we went into the recording. But sometimes what happens is life can be stable. So you're working, you got family time, social time, whatever it is. However your life is put together, whatever it is you need to do. And then something happens, something comes along, and you could argue nowadays it could be every day, right? Life's can be quite challenging, which really throws a spanner in the works. And sometimes it can be such that you panic, and that panic leads to a lot of anxiety, sleepless nights. It can cause frustration, and it actually makes it so it could possibly also make it difficult for you to then function normally, because your body is so attuned to doing something a certain way. You know what time certain things are. It's like saying, there are people I know, for example, if the meal is not served at 1 o'clock or 7 p.m., it's like they can't function. And you think, wow, that's very on the dot, isn't it? But it's just, you could argue it's a personality, couldn't you? It's just the way we've programmed ourselves, maybe. But how does one how does one stay centered? How,
Hmm.
how do you how do you try to overcome the spanner in the works, the days of uncertainty? And we all have them. It's just life, right? There's nothing wrong with that. It's just the way life is.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, yeah, we get those little kind of rug pulls, let's say. We can get small ones on a daily basis, but then every now and again, life sends us a big one.
Mm,
Something that really comes left field. Let's say a person who's been very identified with their role or with their job, and suddenly they lose the job. They get made redundant. They didn't
mm,
see that coming. Or the marriage breaks down, or something happens with a loved one or with one of your children, and suddenly all of your energy and attention has to go away from what you thought was the most important thing in your life towards this other thing, which has come unexpected. And so I think partly what we're up against there, and in a way, this is to me is like the gift of what these events and these interventions bring to us, if we can see it as a gift, is that they help us to see where we've misidentified, where we've mistakenly identified ourselves as being the person who is in this role, or the person whose life looks a particular way, or we've tied our well-being to a particular life circumstance. Like the example that you gave. If there's a certain order in my life and a certain routine, well, as long as that's maintained, I get to feel secure. But if any of that somehow gets disturbed, my security goes with it. Now, to me, it's a simple case of misunderstanding where true security comes from. And it's a very common and very easy mistake that any of us can make, because as humans, we do tend to associate our security with life circumstance, with other people, with jobs, with finances, with status. There's all kinds of things we can attach our security and our well-being to. It turns out that it doesn't come from any of those places. So the gift that life shows us by pulling the rug, essentially the invitation is to dig deeper and say, well, where's your real source of security? Is it really in this role?
Mm.
Is it really in this routine? Is it really in this amount of money in the bank? No. So it requires us to fall back on something deeper and to get in touch with what I would call the true source of our well-being, the true source of our inner security. And the good news is that it's actually innate. It's to be found within. It's not to be found in anything external to us. Most of us don't discover that until we have to.
Yeah.
But for me, the invitation is to discover that before you have to. What I've come to learn is that actually you can uncover that within yourself, even when your life's going pretty well. And that's the best time to do it. You don't need life to intervene in order to show you that. You can actually start to, just through insight, through realization, you can start to see where you've innocently tied your insecurity to, let's say, to something that it doesn't really belong to be tied to. And to the extent that you're able to see that and to recognize that, oh, actually, that's not really where my true well-being lies, then you can start to make that internal shift voluntarily, let's say. I think if the degree to which we make it voluntarily is the degree to which life doesn't have to keep delivering the blow.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I do, I mean, as many people know, I do a lot of voluntary work and helping those less fortunate in society, the vulnerable. And it's such a humbling experience. And what I'm leading to is the fact that they're always smiling, Ian. They're always happy, irrespective of the fact they're really, really struggling.
Yeah.
And on the other side, you've got somebody who perhaps has relatively no issues, and maybe something happens during the day, which again, it happens, it's life, we get ups and downs, and it totally overtakes them, and that's all they're worrying about. And I always think, and I think, but how happy are they? And how humble they are,
Yeah.
and how content they are, and the fact they can have a conversation with you, and it's generally a humbling conversation in 99% of times.
Yeah.
How are you? And oh, look, I went through this, and I became homeless, or I had this health issue and now I'm struggling with this. And then they always find, they ask you questions like, oh, but tell me about yourself. And you think, wow, what do you mean? I should be asking you. I'm here to look after you, right? It's amazing, isn't it? Life and the intricacies and the simplicities, and then those who are well above, advanced in life, and those who are just living but are happy.
That's beautiful. And to me, that is the proof that true well-being, it is innate, it is within everyone, and it's not conditional. It's not dependent on the things that we tend to think it's dependent on. I first saw that when I traveled to India as a young man, and I thought I was prepared for the assault on the senses that India is, when you go for the first time.
Yeah.
What really shocked me more than anything going to India, it wasn't the things that I'd been warned about. What shocked me was what you just described there. It was meeting people, many of whom were literally living on the streets with what looked like nothing compared to what I had as a Westerner. And yet they had a level of contentment and happiness that I could see exceeded my own at that stage in my life. And that really unsettled me. That got under my skin, because I was like, wait a minute. I thought you needed to a certain level of, what about Maslow's hierarchy here?
Yeah.
Are we not supposed to have a certain level of material comfort and so on taken care of before we can be okay in ourselves? And these people were showing me visibly, undeniably, that wasn't true, that wasn't the case, that there was the human spirit actually doesn't need the things that we claim that it needs in order to thrive. It's actually built to thrive.
Absolutely. Many years ago during the Bosnian War, I went with a humanitarian convoy. It was grueling because we drove through Europe and it was in winter in December. And we went to the refugee camp for the displaced citizens and those just suffering, and they were very vulnerable. But you know, Ian, it was such an eye-opener because they literally had nothing as refugees, and yet it was an old army barracks that they were housed in temporarily. And they invited us every evening, different families. Would you like some tea? You know how guilty that made me feel because I thought, hang on, I'm the one who should be helping you. And then they would ask me, oh, what do you do? And how is England? And all these questions. And near the end, I remember it was snowing very, very heavily. We were in Hungary. And I looked out the window and the children were just sitting in the snow and they were at peace. And I literally mean that because I was observing them. I knew the children by then. We were there for 2 weeks and we spent 24 hours with them, literally. We were in the same buildings. We met them everywhere, spent a lot of time with them. But there was, I suppose, let me rephrase. I can't say they were at peace, but there was so much contentment on their face,
Yeah.
you know? And they were so in the now, and it was just how to deal with it and how to move forward. Boy, was it a life lesson for me. And because I thought, wow, now here I am thinking my jacket's not fluffy enough because it's really cold.
Right.
They weren't bothered about things like that. They were saying, oh, how are you? Come around and see my parents. Come and have some tea with us or bread.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Life is just, as we talk about this, I'm just thinking, we so overcomplicate life, don't we? So overcomplicate it.
We do, and I think what your story illustrates beautifully is that there's a difference between hardship, let's say, and difficulty, which many people go through a level of hardship that maybe you and I have never had to face. But there's a difference between that and suffering. And suffering is something, and this was what the Buddha identified, remember, he was born in a palace, he was brought up in a very wealthy environment, but he recognized that suffering is something that's created in the human mind. And therefore it's not something that is caused by life circumstance, but nor is it something that's alleviated by money or status or having all the nice things. That actually doesn't alleviate suffering because it doesn't address the cause of suffering. Suffering is created through what Sydney Banks, who is the originator of the three principles understanding, his expression for it is very beautiful. He said it's just the innocent misuse of the gift of thought. Innocent misuse of the gift of thought, meaning that we habitually use the gift of thought against ourselves. And that actually creates the suffering that we experience in the form of anxiety, fear, worry, neurosis, and the 10,000 other forms, right? They're all variations on that one theme. He went so far as to say there's really only one mental illness. He said that is really the source of all psychological suffering. It's everything else is just a variation of that. And the more that I've looked into this, the more that looks true to me.
It takes me on to another example. My uncle was a homeopath in East Africa, and I visited him on several occasions, working with him, doing research, etc., etc. And again, there I was introduced to a lot of, not introduced, but I was able to observe a lot of poverty. And yet, they were more content, Ian, than I was. Just that smile on their face.
Yeah.
And it's such an important lesson, isn't it? And we started all of this about conversation with mindfulness or mindlessness, and the personalities and the achievements and the self and find it's so important, isn't it, to be humble. It's so important to be grateful and to show gratitude. If you help me, it's so important for me to say thank you, Ian. When you come on the show and my guests come on the show, I'm just using an example. It's so important to recognize and be grateful to somebody. And that goes out to life, doesn't it not? To the rest of everything that you do.
Of course, yeah. And I think there's a difference between doing that as a kind of practice or as a technique versus just having that arise
Mm.
from a true place, where you actually, that's genuinely what you feel. You feel grateful for the experience that you're having and for the, the gifts that life is bringing you. When it arises as a natural phenomena, that's the best. And that to me is like, it's like the perfume.
Yeah.
It's not something that you're having to manufacture. It's something that just like gratitude and forgiveness and other things, they naturally arise when you have a certain, let's say, a certain kind of understanding within yourself. And that understanding has to do with who you really are on the inside, and recognizing, I would say that it has to include the spiritual dimension of life to have that understanding. Because otherwise we are caught in the temporary forms. The personality is a temporary form. Everything we think and feel is a temporary form. All of the roles that we fulfill are temporary forms. The body itself is a temporary form. But what is it that's beyond all of that? If we're in touch with that, then we can still maintain that perspective, even in the midst of outward chaos and things falling apart and things not going to plan. If we're in touch with, if we're anchored in that formless dimension, that spiritual dimension on the inside, then we can allow for the temporary forms to come and go, because that's nature, that's life. Everything that comes into form is temporary.
Again, very poetically said, and it just reminded me of a social media feed I saw just yesterday. And it, again, every day is an opportunity to learn. Whether or not you've heard the message again and again, it always brings a new angle to it. And it was a very straightforward feed, which showed a picture from 100 years ago of people walking in a street. And the voiceover said, "Do you recognize anyone in this picture?" And he said the majority of the population in the world would not know who these people are. They were here, they lived in houses, some of them had cars, and then they left, and nobody remembers them. Nobody knows what houses, how much money they earned, what their profession was. And the idea was to drum it into us, about simplicity and about not to take something so seriously that it disturbs who you really are supposed to be. It's basically everything that you've just said, just be humble and deal with life's challenges as they come along. You've said so beautifully, it's life. It's just life, right? That's something we have to get used to.
Yeah.
The way life is, isn't it? It is what it is, I suppose, for want of a better word.
That's right, which is an overused phrase these days, but it actually it points to a deep truth, I think, because the degree to which we can accept life the way it is, and that includes accepting ourselves the way we are, is the degree to which we can live in that place of contentment. And the flip side of that is what Byron Katie, I think, was the one who coined it beautifully. She said, when you argue with reality, you suffer.
Mm.
When we try to have life be some way other than the way it actually is, we're the one who suffers, because we're actually resisting life in the form that it's showing up. And that's not to say that we can't make changes in our life circumstance if we see that possibility, but it's the difference between knowing that we can do that from a place of choice when that's available to us versus thinking that the world has to change so that we can feel okay. That's the difference. And that's the trap. The trap is always when the thinking mind gets busy, we tend to look to, what do we need to change? What do we need more of? Or what do we need to get rid of so that we can find that place of contentment and peace that we're all looking for? And the mistake there is believing that feeling will come when something outside of us changes. It doesn't have anything to do with that.
I do hope you've enjoyed this week's episode of the Homeopathy Health Show. Please do support the show by clicking follow on my socials. Remember, the more exposure the podcast receives, the better for homeopathy around the world. You can find me on Instagram by searching for @like_treatslike. and on both Facebook and TikTok by searching for @LikeTreatsLike. So let's promote the voice of homeopathy on radio and podcast around the world together. Don't forget to visit me online at www.liketreatslike.co.uk and click on the radio and podcast tab. Here you'll be able to see all the guests that have joined me on the show so far, and of course you can stream on demand the latest episode to your mobile, tablet or PC. Until next time, stay safe and take care.